If you are enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is James Blackwood, and this happened to me back in 1991 when I was working as a ranger in White Mountain National Forest, New Hampshire. Before I tell you what I saw there, I should mention that I wasn't just any regular forest ranger. I used to work for the FBI's occult division, dealing with cases that most people would call unexplainable. But what I experienced in those mountains still gives me nightmares. I was 38 then, trying to build a quiet life after losing my FBI partner Mike to something we were never supposed to talk about. Those memories still hurt. That's why I chose to become a ranger. I thought being surrounded by nature would help me heal. Plus, I could continue my research into strange creatures without raising too many eyebrows. Looking back, maybe that's what drew me right into another nightmare. The locals always said White Mountain had secrets. Old stories about Native American burial grounds, mysterious stone circles, and people going missing. I didn't pay much attention at first. Every small town has its spooky tales, right? But then things started happening that even my FBI training couldn't explain. It all began during the blood moon eclipse that October. The animals started acting weird first. Bears walking backwards, birds flying in perfect circles, deer standing completely still for hours like statues. I'd been a ranger long enough to know this wasn't normal. The weather got strange too. One minute it would be freezing cold, the next so hot you could barely breathe. I knew something was terribly wrong, but I had no idea I was about to face the most horrifying case of my life. What happened in those woods over the next few days changed me forever. And now, for the first time, I'm going to tell you everything. It was a Tuesday when I found the first dead animal. I was doing my usual morning patrol, checking the camping areas, when I spotted something that made my stomach turn. A deer lay in a small clearing, but something was horribly wrong. It looked like someone had turned it inside out, yet there was barely any blood around. In my FBI days, I'd seen some awful things, but this was different. My hands shook as I took pictures with my camera. That same evening, the temperature dropped so fast that my coffee froze in its cup, just like that, in seconds. I called the weather station, but they said everything was normal on their end. I knew better. 20 years of investigating weird stuff teaches you when something isn't right. The next day, 3 hikers came running to my station. They were shaking, not from the cold, but from fear. They told me they'd seen someone walking through the trees, someone wearing what looked like another person's face like a mask. I might have thought they were making it up, except I'd seen something similar in an old case file. More strange things kept happening. At noon exactly, shadows started appearing where they shouldn't be. Dark shapes moving against the sunlight, like black holes walking around. People reported seeing doubles of their friends, exact copies walking through the forest. And then the missing persons reports started coming in. I called my old FBI contact, Sarah, that night. "Something's happening here," I told her. "Something big." She was quiet for a long time before answering. "James," she said, "there have been reports like this before, in that same forest. Every 30 years, like clockwork. The last time was in 1961. They covered it up." I looked at my calendar. 1991. 30 years exactly. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with some random event. Something had woken up in these woods, something that had been sleeping for a long time. The next morning, a group of 8 teenagers set up camp near the old stone circles. I tried to warn them away. Those circles had a dark history. But they just laughed, thinking I was some paranoid old ranger. I should have tried harder to make them leave. I should have done something. Because what happened to them that night was just the beginning of our nightmare. I'll never forget the screams that woke me at 3 a.m. They came from the direction of the teenagers' camp. I grabbed my flashlight and my silver knife, something I always kept from my FBI days, even though people thought I was crazy for having it. As I ran through the dark forest, my radio crackled with static. When I reached their campsite, what I saw made my blood freeze. The tents were shredded, like something had torn through them from the inside. Camping gear was scattered everywhere. But the worst part? There were 8 sleeping bags, but only 7 teenagers. One was missing. Then I saw it, a shape moving in the darkness. At first, I thought it was Jenny, the missing girl. But when my flashlight beam caught it, I realized something was terribly wrong. It looked like Jenny, but not quite. The way it moved was different. Like someone wearing a Jenny costume, trying to copy how humans walk. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice shaking. The thing that looked like Jenny turned its head too far, farther than any neck should turn. Its eyes were completely black, like empty holes. The other teenagers were huddled together, crying. "That's not Jenny," one of them whispered. "We saw her taking her face off." Just then, my radio came to life. Through the static, I heard a voice, Jenny's voice, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest, calling for help. But Jenny's shape was still standing right in front of me, grinning with too many teeth. I knew what we were dealing with now. The old Native American legends, the stories about skinwalkers, they were all true. This creature could steal people's faces, wear their skins like clothes, and now it was hunting in my forest. I got the teenagers to safety, but Jenny was never found. The police came, of course. They wrote it off as an animal attack, a missing person case, but I knew better. And things were about to get much worse. The next day, 2 of my fellow rangers went to investigate the stone circles. Only one came back, or at least something that looked like one of them came back. Mark and Steve, 2 of our best rangers, went to check the stone circles that morning. I wanted to go with them, but I had to stay at the station to handle the police reports about Jenny. That decision haunts me to this day. Around noon, Steve came running back to the station. Something was off about him, the way he moved, how his uniform sat wrong on his body. His eyes looked empty. "Mark's hurt," he said, but his voice sounded wrong, like someone trying to copy Steve's voice, but not quite getting it right. "You need to come quick." Every instinct screamed at me not to follow him. I'd seen enough in my FBI days to know when something wasn't right. I pretended to reach for my jacket, but instead grabbed my silver knife and my radio. "Lead the way," I said, keeping my distance. As we walked through the forest, I noticed something strange. Steve wasn't leaving any footprints in the mud, not a single one. The real Steve was 6'2" and weighed over 200 pounds. He always left deep footprints. When we got close to the stone circles, I heard a muffled sound coming from behind a large oak tree. There, tied up and gagged, was the real Steve. I looked back at the thing I'd been following. It was changing. Its skin seemed to melt, revealing something dark and ancient underneath. I threw my silver knife. It hit the creature's shoulder, and the sound it made, imagine 1,000 crows screaming all at once. The thing that wasn't Steve disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind what looked like a piece of torn skin. After I untied Steve, he told me something terrible. He said he and Mark had found something in the stone circles, old bones arranged in a pattern, but before they could radio it in, something grabbed Mark. Steve said he saw Mark's face being peeled off, like taking off a mask. That night, I locked myself in the station and started making calls. I needed help, but as I looked out the window, I saw them, dozens of faces I recognized. Faces of missing people from the past few days, all standing still, watching the station, waiting. And in the middle of them all was Mark, or something wearing Mark's face, smiling at me with too many teeth. The situation was getting worse by the hour. I called in a search party from the nearby town, 20 experienced people who knew these woods well. Looking back, I wish I hadn't. I was just leading more people into danger. We split into 4 groups of 5. I gave everyone silver crosses, something I'd learned to carry from my FBI days. Whatever you do, I warned them, if you see someone walking alone, even if it's one of us, don't approach them. Radio first. Everything went wrong around sunset. The radio started picking up strange voices, people calling for help, children crying, even our own voices calling out to each other. Then the time loops began. I watched my group walk past the same tree 5 times, even though we were walking straight. The sun kept setting and rising every few minutes. One woman in my group, Sarah, started crying when she saw herself standing between the trees, waving at her. Then the screams started, not from one direction, but from everywhere. Group 2 radioed in. They'd found their team leader's body, but he was still walking with them. Group 3 stopped responding completely. Group 4 said they were being chased by something wearing multiple faces at once. I tried to get everyone to retreat back to the ranger station, but the forest itself seemed to be changing. Paths that had been there for decades suddenly ended in stone walls. Trees moved when we weren't looking. And everywhere we turned, we saw faces, faces of people we knew, faces of the missing, faces that shouldn't exist. My group finally made it back to the station, but we were only 8 people now. 12 others were just gone. And those who made it back weren't all right. Tom kept insisting he was actually Mike, and Sarah wouldn't stop staring at her reflection in the window, touching her face like she wasn't sure it was really hers. As night fell, we could see them gathering outside, dozens of copies of the missing people, all slightly wrong in different ways. They just stood there, watching us, waiting. But the worst part? When I did a head count of our survivors, I counted 9 people. We were only supposed to be 8. My hands were shaking as I counted again. 8 people had made it back, but now there were 9 of us in the station. Someone, or something, wasn't who they claimed to be. I looked at each face carefully. Lisa, the local guide. Tom, who kept saying he was Mike. Sarah, still touching her face. Pete and Dan, the brothers who ran the local hunting shop. Maria, the nurse. John, the retired cop. And Chris, the Forest Service volunteer. Everyone, I said quietly, we need to check something. One at a time, I want you to touch this. I pulled out my silver cross. In my FBI days, I'd learned that skinwalkers couldn't touch silver without revealing themselves. The tension in the room was unbearable. One by one, they touched the cross. Lisa, fine. Tom, fine. Sarah, fine. Pete, fine. Dan hesitated. Come on, Dan, his brother Pete said. Just touch it. Dan's hand reached out, shaking. Just before he touched the cross, he jerked back. And then, his face began to ripple, like water in a pond. That's not Dan, Pete screamed, backing away from what looked like his brother. Where's my real brother? The thing that wasn't Dan smiled, and its mouth kept widening until it split its whole face. The lights in the station flickered, and in those flashes, we could see its true form, something ancient and dark, wearing Dan's skin like a loose coat. We all ran for different doors, but outside was worse. The copies of missing people had moved closer, surrounding the station. Their faces were all wrong now, melting, changing, shifting between different people we knew. Through my radio, I heard Dan's real voice, weak and distant. Help, stone circles, they're doing something. I knew then what I had to do. The stone circles, that's where this all started, and that's where it had to end. I gripped my silver knife tightly and turned to the others. I'm going to the circles, I said. Anyone who comes with me. I can't promise you'll come back. Sarah and John stepped forward. The others barricaded themselves in the station. As we stepped into the dark forest, the creatures parted to let us through, still wearing their stolen faces. They were leading us somewhere. And deep in the forest, the blood moon was rising again. The walk to the stone circles was the longest 10 minutes of my life. The blood moon turned everything red, making shadows look like pools of blood. Every few steps we'd see faces watching us from behind trees. Some we knew, some from missing people posters, all of them wrong in small, creepy ways. Sarah grabbed my arm suddenly. James, she whispered, look at John. I turned. John was walking normally, but his shadow was walking backwards. Before I could say anything, he turned to us with a smile that was too wide. "Not John either," I said quietly to Sarah. "Run." We sprinted toward the stone circles, the thing that wasn't John chasing us. When we finally reached the clearing, what we saw made us stop dead in our tracks. The stone circles were glowing with a dim red light. In the center, tied to the stones, were all the missing people: Dan, Mark, Jenny, and others. They were alive but barely moving. And standing in the middle was something I'll never forget. It looked like an old woman, but she was wearing pieces of different people's skin like a patchwork dress. Parts of her were shifting, changing, like she couldn't decide which face to wear. This was the original skinwalker, the one from all the old Native American legends. "Welcome, James Blackwood," she said in many voices at once. "We've been waiting for you. Your fear. It smells delicious." Sarah's hand tightened around her silver cross. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice shaking. The skinwalker laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Want? I want what I've always wanted. New skins to wear, new lives to steal. And now," she gestured at the blood moon above, "now is the time of our feast." All around us, more creatures emerged from the darkness. They were all shifting, changing, wearing faces we knew. We were surrounded. I gripped my silver knife tighter. After losing my FBI partner Mike to something supernatural, I'd promised myself I'd never let evil win again. But as I stood there, watching these monsters wearing human skins, I wondered if this time I'd finally met something I couldn't beat. The skinwalker moved closer, her patchwork skin rippling in the moonlight. "Your partner Mike," she said in that horrible multi-voice. "He tasted wonderful. Such fear at the end." Something snapped inside me. That monster had killed Mike? All these years, I'd never known what really happened to him. I felt a rage I'd never known before. "Sarah," I whispered, "when I say run, get to the captives, free as many as you can." The skinwalker raised her arms, and the blood moon seemed to pulse. The tied-up victims started screaming. Their skin was beginning to loosen, like it was preparing to be peeled off. "Run!" I shouted, and threw my silver knife straight at the skinwalker. It hit her in the chest, and she screamed, a sound that made the trees shake. All the creatures wearing stolen faces started moving at once. Sarah ran to the captives while I fought. I had more silver crosses in my pocket, and I threw them like throwing stars. Each time one hit, a creature would melt back into shadows, leaving behind empty skin like shed snakeskin. But the old skinwalker was strong. She pulled my knife from her chest, her wound healing instantly. "Fool," she laughed. "I've lived for centuries. I've worn 1,000 skins. Your silver can't kill me." She was right. The knife hadn't killed her. But then I remembered something from my FBI files. Skinwalkers draw power from their collected skins. And right now, Sarah was freeing their victims, taking away their power source. The skinwalker must have realized this too. She turned towards Sarah with a horrible shriek, but she'd forgotten about me. I tackled her, and we both fell into the center of the stone circle. As we hit the ground, something strange happened. The stones started glowing brighter, and I felt power, old, ancient power, flowing through me. The skinwalker felt it too. She started screaming, but this time in fear. The stone's light grew brighter and brighter, like they were alive. I could feel their energy burning through my body. The skinwalker tried to break free, but I held on tight. Her skin started peeling away, showing what she really was underneath, something dark and ancient that hurt my eyes to look at. "The stones," Sarah yelled while untying the last victim. "There's some kind of trap. The Native Americans must have built them to catch her." The skinwalker screamed again, but now she sounded scared. Really scared. "No, not the circle, not again." All her fake faces started falling off like autumn leaves. The other creatures, the ones wearing stolen faces, began melting into shadows. But something was happening to me too. The stone's power was changing me. "James," Sarah shouted, "your face, it's..." I couldn't see myself, but I could feel it. The power of the stone circle was burning into me, marking me. I knew I was changing, becoming something different. But I didn't let go. I couldn't let this monster escape, not after everything she'd done. The blood moon above turned black. The skinwalker made one last terrible scream, and then she just dissolved, like dark smoke in the wind. All around us, the stolen faces and empty skins crumbled to dust. When it was over, all the victims were safe, but changed. They'd never forget what happened. And me? I survived, but the stones left their mark. Every full moon, my face shifts a little, reminds me of that night. The forest is different too, darker somehow. Things still happen here that I can't explain. The government covered it all up, of course, called it a mass hallucination, blamed it on bad water or gas leaks, but the locals know. They see me patrolling the forest at night, making sure no more skinwalkers come back. Sometimes, on really dark nights, I think I see faces in the trees. And every now and then, someone goes missing. But now, I'm here to protect them. The stones changed me, gave me the power to fight these things. I'm still James Blackwood, Forest Ranger, but I'm something else too now. A guardian, a protector. And as long as I'm here, no more skinwalkers will ever hurt anyone in my forest again. It's been 34 years since that night in White Mountain National Forest. I'm still here, still watching, still protecting. The scars from the stone circles never really healed. Every full moon, I catch my reflection changing in the window, just for a second. But I've learned to live with it. Sarah visits sometimes. She's the only other person who really understands what happened. The survivors we rescued that night, they moved away, all of them. Can't blame them. Some things you just can't forget. The forest has changed too. It's darker now, like it's keeping secrets. The animals know. They stay away from the stone circles. Even the birds go quiet when they fly over that spot. The government built a fence around it, put up dangerous ground signs. If they only knew the real reason. Last week, a young ranger asked me why I never leave, why I'm still here after all these years. I just smiled and told her I like the quiet. But the truth? I stay because I have to. Every 30 years, when the blood moon rises, something stirs in these woods, and I'll be ready. Sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers in the trees. Sometimes, I see shadows moving in impossible ways. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see her, the skinwalker, watching me from between the trees. But maybe that's just what the stones did to me, making me see things that aren't there. Or maybe she's still out there, waiting. I keep my silver knife sharp. I patrol the forest every night. The local folks leave offerings at my door, silver crosses, blessed items, letters of thanks. They know something's different about me, about their forest. They know I protect them, even if they don't know from what. To anyone reading this, if you ever visit White Mountain National Forest, and you see someone walking alone at night, someone who looks a bit wrong, don't approach them. Just call for Ranger Blackwood. I'll come. Because that's what I am now. Not quite human, not quite something else. A protector, a guardian, the one who walks between worlds. And I'll be here, watching, waiting, because the blood moon will rise again, and when it does, I'll be ready. You know, people often ask me if I regret staying here, if I wish I could have a normal life, but how can I leave? Every missing person poster I see, every strange sound in the night, they remind me why I'm here. Just last month, a family reported seeing their daughter in 2 places at once. The local police didn't understand, but I did. I tracked it for 3 nights before finally catching it. Another creature, trying to steal faces like the skinwalker did. It wasn't as powerful as her, but it was just as dangerous. The silver knife did its job. The stone circles still glow sometimes, especially during full moons. I sit there keeping watch, my face shifting in the moonlight. The power they gave me that night, it's both a blessing and a curse. I can sense them now, the dark things that try to enter our world, and I can stop them. Sarah called yesterday. She said there are reports of similar things happening in other forests. Maybe there are more skinwalkers out there. Maybe there are others like me too, changed by ancient powers, protecting their own territories. If you're reading this, and you ever find yourself in White Mountain National Forest, pay attention to the shadows. If you see someone who doesn't look quite right, or if you hear your own voice calling from the trees, run. Run as fast as you can toward the ranger station. Ask for James Blackwood. I'll be there. I'll always be there. Because some stories don't end. They just turn into legends. And sometimes, legends have to stick around to keep people safe. My name is Marcus Hayes, and this happened to me back in the summer of 1969. I was 35 then, working as a ranger at Redwood National Park in California. You know those giant trees that touch the sky? That's where I worked, and what happened there still gives me nightmares. Before I tell you what I saw in those woods, you should know a bit about me. I just come back from Vietnam, where I served as a Green Beret. I thought I'd seen the worst things possible in that war, but I was wrong. So very wrong. The thing is, I'm not just any ranger. I'm part of the Yurok tribe. My grandfather taught me all about our people's connection to these ancient forests and the spirits that live there. Back then, I didn't believe much in spirits. Now, well, let me tell you what happened. That summer was different from any other I'd seen in my years at the park. We were in the middle of the worst drought anyone could remember. The mighty redwoods, some older than 2,000 years, were struggling. The forest felt wrong. The usual sounds of birds and animals had gone quiet in certain areas. And the fog, it didn't move like normal fog should. Sometimes it would crawl against the wind, like it had a mind of its own. One morning, while doing my regular patrol, I found something that made my skin crawl. There were these old rock carvings, petroglyphs, we call them, that I'd never seen before. They showed warnings about something called the Night Walker. My grandfather had mentioned this name in some of his stories, but I'd always thought they were just tales to scare kids. Looking at those carvings, though, something deep inside me knew we were in trouble. I carry my grandfather's ceremonial knife with me everywhere. It's not just any knife. It's been in our family for generations, blessed by our tribal elders. That morning, for the first time ever, I felt it grow cold against my hip, like it was warning me. I should have listened better to that warning, because what happened next would change everything, not just for me, but for everyone who entered those woods. Want to know what happened next? Well, it started with 12 missing hippies and some strange marks on the trees. But that was just the beginning of a nightmare that still haunts these woods today. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when I got the call about the missing hippies. 12 young people who'd been camping near the old grove hadn't been heard from in 5 days. Their families were worried sick. Usually, hippies went off-grid all the time. That's just what they did. But something about this felt different. I drove my ranger truck down the bumpy dirt road to their campsite. The moment I stepped out, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Their tents were still there, flapping in the wind. A pot of half-cooked beans sat on a cold campfire. Guitars were leaning against logs, like their owners had just stepped away for a minute. But the morning dew on everything told me no one had touched these things for days. Then I saw the trees. My hand started shaking as I walked closer. Someone or something had carved strange symbols into the bark. They weren't normal carvings, though. They were dark red, and when I touched one, my fingers came away sticky. It was blood, fresh blood. I radioed back to headquarters, but all I got was static. Weird. My radio had never failed me before. I pulled out my compass to mark the location, but the needle just spun in circles. Even my flashlight started flickering, though I just put in new batteries that morning. That's when I noticed the silence. Not a bird chirping, not a squirrel running around. Nothing. In a forest this big, that's not natural. It's like all the animals knew something I didn't. I was about to head back to my truck when I saw it, black stuff oozing from a nearby tree. At first, I thought it was sap, but sap isn't cold to the touch. Sap doesn't smell like rotten eggs. And sap definitely doesn't make your fingers tingle like they've fallen asleep. Just before sunset, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A baby crying, deep in the woods. I've been a ranger for years, and I know every sound these woods make. This wasn't a mountain lion, wasn't a bird, wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. It sounded exactly like a human baby. But here's the thing. There were no babies anywhere near this part of the forest. Not for miles and miles. I grabbed my grandfather's knife tight and headed back to my cabin. That night, for the first time in my life, I locked all the doors and windows. As I sat there in the dark, listening, I knew something was very wrong in my forest, and I had a feeling those missing hippies were just the beginning. The next morning, I called my partner David to help investigate. We'd worked together for 3 years, and he was as solid as they come. But when he saw those blood symbols on the trees, even he turned pale. "Marcus," he whispered, "I've never seen anything like this." We split up to cover more ground. David took the west side of the camp and I went east. That's when I found the first real clue, a camera hanging from a tree branch. It belonged to one of the missing hippies, a girl named Sarah. My hands were shaking as I opened it. The first few photos were normal, young people laughing, singing around the campfire. But the last 3 photos made my stomach turn. They showed the strange fog I'd been seeing, but in the fog, there was something else. A dark shape, tall as a tree. In each picture, it was getting closer. The final photo was just a blur of black, like something had rushed at the camera. "Marcus, get over here!" David's voice cracked with panic. I ran to him and stopped dead in my tracks. There were footprints in the dirt, but not human footprints. They were huge, deeper than any animal print I'd ever seen. And they went straight through a fallen log. Not over it, not around it, through it. Like whatever made them could walk through solid objects. Then we heard it, that baby crying again, closer this time. David reached for his radio, but it was dead like mine. The cry came again, from behind us. We turned around slowly, and that's when I saw David's face change. His eyes went wide, and he just froze. "Don't move," he whispered. I could feel something watching us. The air got cold, so cold I could see my breath. That black ooze started dripping from every tree around us, and the smell, like something had died a long time ago. Slowly, I reached for my grandfather's knife. As soon as I touched it, it burned hot in my hand. And then, for just a second, I saw what David was seeing. Standing between 2 ancient redwoods was a shape darker than the shadows. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen. But it wasn't a man. It had a head like a wolf, but its eyes were pure black, like endless pits. I blinked, and it was gone. David collapsed, shaking like a leaf. "We need help," I said, helping him up. "This is bigger than us." What I didn't know then was that asking for help would lead to the worst night of my life. Because the thing in the woods, it wasn't just hunting those hippies. It was hunting all of us. The next day, we brought in a search party. 4 local men who knew these woods well. There was Mike, a logger, Tom and his brother Sam, both hunters, and Bill, who'd lived near the redwoods his whole life. I didn't want to bring anyone else into this mess, but we needed help. David wasn't himself that morning. His hands wouldn't stop shaking, and he kept scratching his arms until they bled. When I asked if he was okay, he just stared at me with empty eyes and said, "It's in my head, Marcus. I can hear it whispering." We started the search at sunrise. The plan was simple. Stay together, keep our radios on, though they barely worked, and search sector by sector. But plans don't mean much when you're dealing with something you don't understand. Around noon, things got worse. We found 3 dead deer near the burial grounds my grandfather had told me about. They weren't just dead. They were cut open with surgical precision, like someone had performed an operation. but there wasn't a drop of blood anywhere. Then Bill noticed something strange. All the smaller animals, squirrels, rabbits, even birds, were walking in the same direction, like they were in a trance. Their eyes looked glazed over, empty. When I tried to shoo away a raccoon, it didn't even blink. "Marcus," Tom called out, his voice shaking. "Look at David." David was standing perfectly still, staring into the woods. Blood was dripping from his nose, and he was smiling. Not a normal smile, it was too wide, showing too many teeth. Before I could reach him, he pulled out his knife and started cutting into his own arm. "The Nightwalker wants us to join them," he said in a voice that wasn't his own. "They're all with him now, all 12 of them, and soon we'll join them too." That's when we heard the baby crying again. But this time, it came from 5 different directions at once. The fog rolled in thick and black, moving against the wind just like before. And in that fog, we saw them, pairs of black eyes, dozens of them, floating in the darkness. Bill screamed first. I'll never forget that sound, or what happened next. Everything happened so fast. Bill ran, but not toward safety. He ran straight into the fog. We heard his scream cut off suddenly, like someone had flipped a switch. Tom and Sam tried to run too, but the animals, those innocent forest creatures, suddenly turned violent. Dozens of them attacked at once, like they were being controlled by something. The fog got thicker, and that's when I saw it clearly for the first time. The black-eyed beast stood there, tall as a young redwood. Its fur was darker than the darkest night, and its eyes, looking into them, was like falling into a bottomless pit. I couldn't move. None of us could. It was like its eyes had frozen us in place. "Marcus," Mike's voice snapped me out of it. "Your knife! Use your grandfather's knife." My hands were shaking as I pulled out the ceremonial knife. It was glowing now, something I'd never seen before. The beast noticed it too, let out a howl that shook the entire forest. The sound was like nothing on earth, part wolf, part human, and part something much, much older. Tom and Sam. I still have nightmares about what happened to them. The beast moved through trees like they were made of smoke, appearing and disappearing. One moment it was 30 feet away, the next it was right behind them. They never had a chance. Mike managed to fire his rifle, but the bullets went right through the beast like it wasn't even there. Then David, my partner, started laughing that horrible laugh again. He walked toward the beast with his arms wide open, like he was greeting an old friend. "David, no!" I screamed, but it was too late. The beast touched him with one long black claw, and David, he just collapsed. His eyes turned completely black, just like the beast's. He started crawling on all fours, sniffing the air like an animal. Then he turned toward me, and I knew my partner was gone. I gripped my grandfather's knife tighter. The metal was burning hot now, and strange symbols on its handle were glowing red. Somehow, I knew what I had to do. My grandfather's stories about the Nightwalker weren't just stories, they were warnings. And now, I was the only one left who could stop it. I remembered my grandfather's words, "The Nightwalker fears what it cannot corrupt." The knife in my hands was blessed by generations of tribal elders. Maybe that's why it was glowing now. I started chanting the protection prayer my grandfather taught me, the words coming back from somewhere deep in my memory. The beast didn't like that, not one bit. The fog swirled around us like a tornado, and the baby cries turned into screams that came from everywhere. David was circling me like a wild animal, foam dripping from his mouth, but I kept chanting. Then I saw them, transparent shapes in the fog, the missing hippies. They were like ghosts, their eyes as black as the beast's. Behind them were others, hikers and campers who'd gone missing over the years. The beast had taken them all. "You want to join them, Marcus?" David spoke. But it wasn't his voice anymore. "Just like your grandfather wanted to join us." That stopped me cold. "What did you say about my grandfather?" The beast made a sound like laughing. Through David it spoke again. "He found us too, 30 years ago. But he was stronger than we expected. He trapped us in the burial ground with that knife. Now we're free, and you'll be the first to join us." That's when it hit me, the burial ground. The symbols on the knife matched the ones carved on the ancient stones there. My grandfather hadn't just found the beast, he'd fought it and won. The beast lunged at me, moving faster than anything that big should move. But this time, I was ready. I rolled under its massive arm and ran, not away from it, but toward the burial ground. I could hear it chasing me, feel its hot breath on my neck. David and all those possessed animals were right behind it. The burial ground was just ahead, its ancient stones glowing faintly in the darkness. I had one chance to get this right, one chance to finish what my grandfather started. I reached the burial ground just as the beast caught up to me. The stones were arranged in a perfect circle, just like my grandfather had described. With shaking hands, I held up the glowing knife. The beast stopped at the edge of the circle, snarling. "This ends now," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. The beast threw back its head and let out a laugh that shook the trees. Suddenly, all those ghost-like figures, the hippies, the missing hikers, and David, they surrounded me. Their black eyes stared right through me. That's when I saw the carvings on the center stone. They matched the symbols on my knife perfectly. Without thinking, I slammed the knife into the stone. It fit like a key in a lock. Everything exploded into bright light. The beast let out a howl that made my ears bleed. The ghost figures started swirling around like they were caught in a whirlpool. David collapsed to the ground. The possessed animals fell over, suddenly free. But the beast wasn't done. It charged at me, moving through the stone circle like it was nothing. Its claws caught my face, and pain shot through my eyes. I couldn't see, but I could feel the knife vibrating in the stone. I held onto it with everything I had, still chanting my grandfather's prayer. The beast's screams got higher and higher. The ground shook. Trees creaked and groaned. Then, silence. Complete silence. When I opened my eyes, everything was dark. Not just dark. I couldn't see anything at all. I was blind. But I could hear again. Normal forest sounds had returned. Birds chirping, squirrels running around. David was groaning nearby, alive but confused. The beast was gone, but it had taken my sight as its final act of revenge. The official report called it a chemical spill. They quarantined the area and told everyone to stay away. David recovered but didn't remember anything. The missing people were never found. That was 56 years ago. I'm an old man now, still living near these woods. I can't see them anymore, but I can feel them. The trees where it all happened never decay. And on full moon nights, when the fog rolls in, people still hear strange howls. Some say the beast is gone forever, but I know better. My grandfather only trapped it. I did the same. Someday, it'll break free again. That's why I'm telling this story, because someone needs to be ready when it does. If you're ever in the Redwoods and hear a baby crying in the distance, or see fog moving against the wind, run. Run as fast as you can. Because the black-eyed beast of Redwood is always hungry, always waiting, and always watching. My name is Frank Morrison, and this happened to me back in 1957. I still get chills thinking about those dark winter days at Glacier National Park, Montana. I guess I should start by telling you who I am, a 52-year-old park ranger who's seen more than his fair share of life's ugliness. Before coming to the park, I fought in the Korean War. Those memories still haunt me sometimes, showing up in my nightmares when I least expect them. My lucky compass from those days is always in my pocket. It's one of the few things that still gives me comfort, especially after losing my dear wife Martha to cancer just 2 months ago. I thought coming to work at this remote ranger station would help me heal, give me some peace. Boy, was I wrong. The station sits right in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by ancient glaciers that have been here longer than anyone can remember. The local Native Americans always warned us about this place, especially in winter. They talked about something they called the ice walker. Back then, I didn't believe in such stories. Now, Well, let me tell you what happened during that brutal winter of 1957. It started when the temperature dropped to negative 40 dU4F, colder than I'd ever felt before. The snow was coming down so heavy that all our access routes were completely cut off. We were 7 rangers up there, all experienced men who knew how to handle tough winters. At least, we thought we did. I remember standing outside one evening, watching these strange lights dance across the sky, the aurora borealis. But something was different about it. The colors weren't right, almost as if they were trying to warn us about what was coming. Little did I know that those weird lights would be just the beginning of the most terrifying experience of my life. What happened next? Well, it's something I've never told anyone before. But I think it's time people knew the truth about what really happened at Glacier National Park that winter. It all started one freezing morning when I couldn't get in touch with Tom, Jack, and Steve, 3 of our best rangers who were supposed to check the eastern trails. They should have radioed in by 10 a.m., but we heard nothing. By noon, my gut was telling me something was wrong. I grabbed my gear and headed out to look for them. The wind was brutal that day, and the snow was so deep it reached my knees. Every step was a struggle. My breath came out in white puffs, and even with my thickest winter coat, the cold bit through to my bones. Then I saw something that made my blood freeze. Tracks in the snow, but not any normal tracks. They were huge, about 15 feet apart from each other. No animal I knew could make jumps that big. My hands started shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. That's when I found them. I wish I hadn't. My 3 friends. What was left of them, scattered across the snow like broken dolls. Something had eaten parts of them. The snow around them was stained red, and their faces were frozen in pure terror. I've seen death before, in the war, but this was different. This was wrong. The way their bodies were positioned, it looked like someone, or something, had arranged them that way on purpose. I reached for my radio with trembling hands. "Base, this is Morrison. We have a situation." My voice cracked as I spoke. But instead of hearing Dave's voice from the base, all I got was strange whispers, words I couldn't understand, in a language that made my skin crawl. Then the temperature dropped suddenly. My thermometer showed negative 60 dU4F. That's when I saw it, just for a second, through the swirling snow. A tall white figure, skinny as a skeleton, at least 12 feet high. It moved so fast I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the worst part? The worst part was when I heard Tom's voice calling my name from behind me. Thing is, I was staring right at Tom's body in the snow. I ran. For the first time since Korea, I ran as fast as I could. Something was out there, something that shouldn't exist. And now it knew we were here. I barely made it back to the station. My lungs were burning from running in the freezing air. Dave and Mike were at the door, and Bob was by the radio. Their faces turned white when they saw me. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. "They're dead," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. All 3 of them. The room went quiet. You could hear a pin drop. We gathered around the old wooden table, and I told them everything. The weird tracks, the bodies, that tall white figure I saw. Bob, who'd been here longest, suddenly looked very old. "The locals warned us," he said quietly. "The ice walker. They said it comes in the worst winters, hunting when the snow is deepest." Just then, the radio crackled to life. We all jumped. Through the static, we heard it. Tom's voice, calling for help. But Tom was dead. I'd seen his body with my own eyes. Mike reached for the radio, but I grabbed his hand. "Don't answer it," I warned. "That's not Tom." The wind outside got stronger, howling like a wounded animal. The temperature inside the station started dropping fast. Our breath came out in clouds, and frost started forming on the windows. "Look!" Dave pointed outside. Through the swirling snow, we saw it. A huge white figure moving impossibly fast between the trees. It was circling our station. The lights started flickering. In the brief moments of darkness, we heard scratching on the walls outside. Then came the voices, not just Tom's now, but Jack's and Steve's too. They were calling us, begging us to let them in. Bob loaded his rifle with shaking hands. "What do we do, Frank?" I pulled out my old compass, running my thumb over its scratched surface. We were trapped in here with that thing outside, and night was coming. "We need to think," I said, trying to stay calm. "Whatever that thing is out there, it's smart, and it's playing with us." Little did I know, this was just the beginning of our nightmare. That thing out there, it was just getting started. That night was the longest of my life. We tried to stay calm, but things kept getting worse. The creature, this Wendigo as Bob called it, it wasn't just strong, it was clever. First, it got Dave. He was checking the back door's locks when suddenly a blast of icy air broke through. The cold was so intense it froze the water pipes instantly. Dave just froze there, his hand still on the lock. We couldn't save him. Mike lost it after seeing Dave like that. "We need to run," he screamed. Before I could stop him, he bolted through the front door. I still hear his screams sometimes. The creature was so fast. One moment Mike was running, the next. Well, I'd rather not say what we found later. Bob and I huddled in the main room, backs against each other. The fireplace was our only warmth and light. That's when I noticed something. Whenever the fire got brighter, the scratching sounds outside got quieter. "Fire," I whispered. "Bob, it's afraid of fire." But just as this realization hit me, the windows shattered. A blast of Arctic air swept through the room, and with it came that thing. In the firelight, I finally saw it clearly, tall as a tree, skin like ice, and so thin it looked starved. Its eyes, they were empty and white, like frozen lakes. Bob fired his rifle, but the bullet seemed to pass right through it. The creature grabbed him with its long, bony fingers. I reached for him, but I was too late. The thing's breath hit Bob, and he turned to ice right in front of me. I was alone now, just me and this ancient horror. The fire was getting low, and I could feel the cold creeping in. But I had an idea, a crazy, desperate idea. I knew I had one chance, just one. The creature was getting closer, and the cold was so bad I could barely move my fingers. But I remembered my old military training. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense. I ran to the storage room, my hands shaking as I grabbed every can of gasoline we had for the generators. The creature was still in the main room, playing with me like a cat with a mouse. I could hear it mimicking my friends' voices, trying to trick me. "Come on out, Frank," it called in Bob's voice. "Let's talk about this." My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. I started splashing gasoline everywhere, on the walls, the floor, the furniture. The whole time I could hear it getting closer, its footsteps making the wooden floors creak. Then I remembered something. The emergency flares in my locker. Red-hot flares that could light up the whole station. I grabbed them with frozen fingers, almost dropping them twice. The creature appeared in the doorway. It was so tall it had to bend down to fit. Those white eyes stared right into mine, and I felt a cold deeper than any winter seep into my soul. "You took my friends," I said, my voice shaking. "Now let's see how you like the heat." I lit the first flare and threw it. The gasoline caught immediately. Flames raced up the walls like angry orange snakes. The creature screamed, a sound I'll never forget, like ice cracking and wind howling all at once. The station was burning around us. Smoke filled the air, but for the first time since this all started, I felt warm. The creature tried to run, but the flames were everywhere. It was trapped. I knew what I had to do next, but the smoke was getting thick, and the flames were everywhere. The creature was screaming, trying to find a way out. I knew I couldn't let it escape. If it did, it would just keep killing. "This ends here," I shouted, holding my last flare. The creature turned to me, its white eyes now filled with something I never expected to see: fear. The roof was starting to cave in. Burning wood fell all around us. The heat was intense, but the creature's cold was still fighting against it. We were in the middle of a war between fire and ice. I looked at my lucky compass one last time. "I'm coming, Martha," I whispered, thinking of my wife. Then I did the only thing I could. I ran straight at the creature, flare in hand. The last thing I remember is the feeling of incredible cold meeting unbearable heat. There was a blast, like thunder and breaking ice mixed together. The station's roof collapsed completely. And then, nothing. They say they rebuilt the station in 1958. They never found my body, or much of anything else in the ashes. But the strangest thing? That spot where it all happened, it never gets warm. Even on the hottest summer day, that ground stays frozen. Some rangers say that during big snowstorms they can hear voices in the wind. My voice, they say, warning others to stay away. Maybe they're right. Maybe a part of me is still there, standing guard. The locals don't talk about the ice walker anymore. Whatever it was, it hasn't been seen since that night. But sometimes, when the aurora lights up the winter sky and the temperature drops below -40°F, the old-timers lock their doors and tell their children to stay inside, because they know that in Glacier National Park, some things are better left alone in the cold and dark. My name is Diana Reynolds, and this happened to me back in 1976 when I was working as a park ranger at Everglades National Park in Florida. I was 41 then, and what I'm about to tell you still gives me nightmares. Sometimes I wake up in cold sweat, wondering if anyone will believe my story. But every word of it is true. Before becoming a ranger, I was a marine biologist. I loved studying water and sea life. But everything changed when my brother Mike disappeared in these same swamps 7 years ago. That's what brought me here. I had to know what happened to him. The locals always whispered about strange things in these waters. But I was a woman of science. I didn't believe in ghost stories or water spirits, at least not until that summer. It was the hottest summer anyone could remember. The heat was so bad that even the alligators were acting weird. I spent my days patrolling the waterways in my boat, carrying special equipment to test the water. You see, things weren't right in the Everglades. The water levels would change for no reason, and at night, parts of the swamp would glow with an eerie blue light that nobody could explain. The old Native Americans living nearby tried to warn us. They kept saying something about a water spirit that woke up every 7 years. I should have listened to them. We all should have listened. But how could I know that those warnings would lead to the most terrifying experience of my life? It all started with the empty boats. First one, then 3, then 7, all drifting empty in the murky water. Each boat was perfectly fine, with no signs of a struggle, but the people were just gone. Their belongings were still there, phones, wallets, fishing gear, but no people. As a ranger, it was my job to investigate, but each boat left me more confused than the last. Then the water started changing. I'll never forget the first time I saw it. I was doing my regular water tests near Gator Island when my equipment started beeping like crazy. Right in front of my eyes, a patch of water turned pitch black, like someone had poured ink into it. But this wasn't normal pollution. The black water moved on its own, like it was alive. The nights became worse. While patrolling after sunset, I started hearing singing. Beautiful but terrifying singing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My flashlight would catch glimpses of something moving under the water, something big, but it would vanish before I could get a good look. My partner Tom thought I was getting paranoid. "Diana," he'd say, "you're letting your brother's disappearance get to you." But then we found the first alligator. I've seen dead gators before, but never like this. It was turned inside out, like something had, well, I still can't explain it. Even Tom couldn't deny something was wrong after that. The worst part was how time started acting strange near certain islands. My watch would show 2 p.m., but the sun would look like it was setting. Or I'd patrol an area for what felt like 20 minutes, only to discover 3 hours had passed. People started calling these places ghost islands, and everyone tried to avoid them. I knew I had to figure out what was happening. 7 years had passed since Mike vanished, and now the same signs were showing up again. Whatever took my brother was back, and this time I was going to face it, even if it meant risking everything. Things got worse really fast. A research team of 6 people came to study the black water. They set up their fancy equipment on one of the bigger islands, and I was supposed to check on them every day. On the 3rd day, when I reached their camp, I saw something I'll never forget. Their tents were still there, but the team, they were just puddles. Human-shaped puddles, with their clothes and equipment scattered around them. It was like they had melted, right where they stood. I radioed for help with shaking hands, but deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. The next day, I lost Tom. We were checking out reports of strange lights near Cypress Creek when it happened. One minute he was standing on his boat taking pictures of the glowing water. The next minute, he was gasping for air, like he was drowning, but he wasn't even in the water. I tried to reach him, but it was too late. It was like the air around him had turned to water, and I watched helplessly as my partner drowned in thin air. When the rescue helicopter came to collect Tom's body, something pulled it right out of the sky. The water below just reached up, like a giant hand, and dragged the whole helicopter down. 3 more people gone, just like that. I can still hear the screams and the awful sound of metal crushing underwater. Then came the animals. Hundreds of them, alligators, birds, fish. They all started swimming or flying straight into the deep parts of the swamp, like they were being called. None of them came back. The locals said the water spirit was getting stronger, feeding on everything it could catch. I knew I had to stop it. Not just for Tom, or the research team, or the helicopter crew, but for Mike, too. All these deaths followed the same pattern as when he disappeared. I had my suspicions about where this thing lived, in an underwater cave system that none of the official maps showed, but the native people knew about it. They called it the Spirit's Lair. That night, I packed my gear and wrote a letter explaining everything, just in case I didn't make it back. Whatever this thing was, it had taken enough lives. It was time to face it, even though I was terrified of what I might find in that cave. I waited until midnight to head out to the cave. The moon was full, making the black patches in the water look even darker. As I steered my boat toward the hidden cave entrance, the singing started again, but this time it was louder than ever. It was like 1,000 voices calling at once, trying to pull me in. The cave entrance was barely visible, just a dark hole at the water level. I put on my diving gear, turned on my underwater lights, and slipped into the water. The moment I went under, I knew something was different. The water felt thick, almost alive, and my compass started spinning wildly. As I swam deeper into the cave, my lights caught glimpses of something moving in the shadows. Whatever it was huge. Then I saw them, the missing boats, dozens of them, all piled up against the cave walls. And there, tangled in the wreckage, was Mike's old jacket. My heart nearly stopped. That's when I saw it. At first, it looked like a moving wall of water, darker than the blackest night. But then it shaped itself into something else, something with eyes. Hundreds of glowing blue eyes, all staring right at me. The water around me started to swirl, and I heard the singing inside my head now. The creature, this water spirit, it showed me things. Visions of all the people it had taken, including Mike. They weren't dead, exactly. They had become part of it, their bodies and minds dissolved into its watery form. I could see their faces forming and dissolving in its body, like a horrible underwater dance. It tried to pull me in, too. The water around me started feeling like quicksand, and my skin began to tingle like it was dissolving. I fought against it with everything I had, but it was so strong. Just when I thought it was over, my hand touched something in my gear belt, my last emergency flare. Without thinking, I pulled the flare and fired it right into the creature's center. The underwater cave lit up like daylight, and the thing, it screamed. Not with one voice, but with hundreds. The water boiled around me. and I saw parts of it starting to evaporate in the intense heat and light. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I swam as fast as I could, fighting against the current it was creating. My lungs were burning, my muscles screaming, but I kept going. Behind me, I could hear it shrieking, feel it trying to grab me, but the flare had hurt it badly. It couldn't follow me into the brighter waters near the surface. I barely made it back to my boat. When I finally pulled myself up and looked in my emergency mirror, I almost screamed. My hair, which had been dark brown that morning, had turned completely white. My face looked 20 years older, with wrinkles I'd never had before. Whatever that thing was, just being close to it had aged me. The next day, government officials swarmed the area. They said it was toxic waste that had caused everything. The deaths, the strange lights, the water changes. But I knew the truth. They closed off that whole section of the Everglades, putting up warning signs and fences. Nobody's allowed to go there anymore. But every year, on the anniversary of that night, people say they can see strange blue lights glowing under the water. The singing starts up again too, but it's fainter now, like it's calling from very far away. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still down there, slowly healing, waiting for another 7 years to pass. I never found Mike's body, or any of the others. Sometimes I think about all those faces I saw inside the creature, wonder if they're still conscious somehow, still part of whatever that thing was. The scientists tested my equipment and the water samples I brought back, but they say the results don't make sense. The readings don't match anything known to science. These days, I live far from any large bodies of water. I can't even take a bath anymore, only quick showers. The doctors say I aged about 20 years in just one night, but they can't explain how. My hair stayed white, and sometimes when it rains, I can hear that singing again, very faintly, calling me back. I'm telling this story now because people need to know the truth. There are things in this world that science can't explain, things that live in the dark waters and prey on the living. If you're ever in the Everglades and you hear singing coming from the water, or see patches of black water moving against the current, run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. Because whatever that water spirit was, I know one thing for certain. It's still alive, and it's still hungry. And somewhere, deep in those forbidden waters, it's waiting for its next chance to feed. Last week, I got a letter that made my hands shake. It was from a young ranger working in the Everglades, someone who'd heard rumors about what happened back then. She wrote that the water levels are changing again, and strange blue lights have been seen in areas where they shouldn't be. 7 years have passed since my encounter. She included a photo that made my blood run cold. It shows a patch of black water, moving against the current, and if you look closely, you can see faces forming in it, dozens of them, just like I remembered. But what terrifies me most is that one of the faces looks fresh, new. Someone went missing in that area just last month. I've tried warning the park authorities, but they won't listen. They still stick to their toxic waste story, but I know better. The 7-year cycle is starting again, and this time, that thing might be even stronger. I can feel it somehow, maybe because part of me is still connected to it after our encounter. Last night, I woke up to the sound of water dripping in my house, even though all the taps were closed. When I went to check, I found puddles of black water on my floor, moving by themselves. And from very far away, I heard that familiar singing. I'm packing my bags tonight. Not to run away, but to go back. That young ranger needs help, and I'm the only one who knows what we're dealing with. I'm older now, and maybe a bit wiser. This time, I'll bring better equipment, and I won't go alone. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that some mysteries don't stay buried forever. Sometimes they rise up from the dark waters, calling us back to face them again. And this time, I'll be ready. If you don't hear from me again, remember my story. And whatever you do, stay away from the Everglades when the water turns black and the singing starts. Because now you know what's really out there, waiting in the depths. My name is William Cooper, and this happened to me back in 1983 when I was working as a cave rescue specialist at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky. I was 45 then, and trust me, what I'm about to tell you still gives me nightmares. Before I tell you what happened in those dark caves, you should know a bit about me. I wasn't always afraid of tight spaces. Actually, I used to love caves. That was until I lost my little girl Sarah in a cave accident 5 years before this story. She was only 12. After that, I developed terrible claustrophobia, that awful fear of being trapped in small spaces. But I forced myself to keep working in caves. Maybe it was my way of facing my demons, or maybe I just wanted to make sure no other parent would go through what I did. I thought I had seen everything in my 20 years of cave rescue work. Strange sounds? Sure. Weird shadows? All the time. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened that autumn in Mammoth Cave. It all started with a routine call about a missing spelunking team. 5 people who went in to explore a newly discovered part of the cave system but never came back out. Simple enough, right? Just another rescue mission. Boy, was I wrong. What we found down there. Well, let me start from the beginning, and you'll understand why I can't sleep in complete darkness anymore. It was the 15th of October when I got the call. A team of 5 explorers had gone into the cave 2 days ago to map a new passage they'd found. They were supposed to check in every 6 hours on their radio, but no one had heard from them for the last 24 hours. I remember checking my special cave mapping device, a new piece of equipment we'd gotten that year. It was supposed to help us find our way through even the darkest parts of the cave. As I packed my gear, something felt different. The air was unusually still, and there was this weird feeling in my stomach, like when you know something bad is about to happen. My partner, Mike, met me at the cave entrance. He'd been my rescue buddy for 3 years, and we trusted each other with our lives. "Something's not right, Will," he said, looking at his compass. The needle's spinning like crazy. I checked mine too, and he was right. The magnetic readings were all wrong, something we'd never seen before. We gathered a team of 3 other rangers, Tom, Lisa, and Steve. As we entered the cave, our flashlights seemed dimmer than usual. The air felt heavy, almost thick, and our voices echoed in strange ways. I'd been in these caves hundreds of times, but something was different today. About an hour in, we found the first sign of the missing team, a backpack lying next to some ancient cave paintings. But these weren't like any cave paintings I'd seen before. I swear, and I know this sounds crazy, but as our lights moved across them, the figures seemed to move. Just a little, just enough to make us all stop and stare. Did you see that?" Lisa whispered. Nobody answered, but I could tell from their faces they'd all seen it too. Then we heard it, a sound that still haunts me. It wasn't an echo, it wasn't water dripping. It was like someone whispering in a language I'd never heard before, coming from deep within the cave. That's when our radio started crackling with static, and my mapping device went completely dead. We knew we had to keep going deeper into the cave, even though every instinct was telling me to turn back. The missing team could be hurt or trapped somewhere, and that was our job, to find them and bring them home. As we walked further in, our footsteps echoing off the walls, we came to a large chamber we'd never seen before. Our lights showed strange rock formations that looked almost like frozen waterfalls. But something was wrong. When Tom knocked against one of the rocks to test its strength, a dark red liquid started oozing out. It looked like blood. "This isn't possible," Mike said, his voice shaking. He was right. Rocks don't bleed. But this one was. Then Lisa pointed to something on the ground. It was a camera, one that belonged to the missing team. I picked it up with trembling hands and checked the last few photos. What we saw made our blood run cold. The final picture showed a tall, thin shadow standing behind the group. But it wasn't just tall, it was impossibly thin, like a piece of paper standing on its edge. That's when we noticed the temperature dropping rapidly. Our breath came out in white clouds, even though it was supposed to be warm this deep underground. The weird whispers we'd heard earlier got louder, and they seemed to be coming from all around us. "Check your watches," Steve suddenly said. Mine said 2:30 p.m. Lisa's said 4:45 p.m. Mike's was running backward. Time itself seemed to be going crazy down here. I was about to suggest we regroup when we heard a scream, the kind of scream that makes your whole body freeze. It was Tom. He was standing about 20 feet away. His flashlight pointed at something in the darkness. But before any of us could reach him, he just disappeared, like someone had switched him off. "Tom!" Lisa yelled. Her voice bounced off the walls, coming back to us in that strange language we couldn't understand. That's when we saw them, shadows moving in the darkness, but not normal shadows. They were moving against our lights, absorbing every bit of brightness we had. We all backed up against each other, our lights pointing outward in a circle. My heart was beating so fast I could hear it echoing in my ears. Mike grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard. "Will," he whispered, "look at the ground." Our shadows were moving the wrong way. Instead of stretching out from our feet, they were sliding toward us like dark puddles of ink coming alive. And in the darkness beyond our lights, we could see them, shapes that looked almost human, but wrong. They were so thin they could slip between rocks, and when they moved, it was like watching paper flutter in the wind. Lisa started praying under her breath. Steve was trying to radio for help, but all we got was that strange whispering sound, louder now. The air felt thick, like trying to breathe underwater. Then it happened so fast, one of those things shot forward like a black streak. It went straight through Mike. Not around him, not over him, but through him. I watched in horror as my partner, my friend, was stretched like rubber and then just collapsed. "Run!" I screamed. We ran blindly through the caves, our lights bouncing off the walls. The shadows were everywhere, sliding along the walls, ceiling, and floor. Steve tripped and fell behind. Lisa tried to go back for him, but I pulled her forward. We could hear his screams fade into that awful whispered language. We turned a corner and found ourselves in a huge chamber with an underground river. The water was black as ink, and the sound of it rushing by almost drowned out the whispers. Almost. "The missing team," Lisa gasped, pointing. There, half buried in the cave wall, were 5 backpacks, but no people. Just empty clothes, flattened like they'd been pressed between pages of a giant book. That's when the ground started shaking. Rocks were falling everywhere. The cave was collapsing, but something told me this wasn't natural. The entities were doing this. They were trying to trap us. Lisa and I ran alongside the underground river, trying to find any way out. The falling rocks were getting bigger, and those shadow things were closing in. I could feel them getting closer. It was like the air got colder and heavier whenever they were near. Then Lisa stopped suddenly. "Will," she said in a strange, calm voice. "They're in my head. They're showing me things. Beautiful things." Her eyes looked empty, like she wasn't really there anymore. Before I could grab her, she walked straight toward one of the shadows. I had to turn away as she just folded in on herself, like a piece of paper being crumpled up. I was alone now. All my teammates were gone. My flashlight was getting dimmer, and the whispers were getting louder. They weren't just sounds anymore, they were thoughts trying to get into my head. They wanted me to give up, to let them in, to show me what they called the beauty of the void. I stumbled through the darkness, using the sound of the river to guide me. My claustrophobia was hitting hard. The walls felt like they were squeezing in. I couldn't tell if hours had passed or just minutes. My watch had stopped completely. Then I saw it, a faint glow ahead. Not the blue-white of our flashlights, but natural light. An opening. I started running toward it, but the shadows weren't going to let me go easily. They surged forward like a black wave. I could feel them pulling at me, trying to flatten me like the others. In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I jumped into the river. The icy water shocked my system, but the current was strong. As I was swept away, I heard their whispers turn into screeches of frustration. The last thing I remember was being thrown against rocks, then seeing daylight. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital. They found me washed up on a riverbank 2 miles from the cave entrance, half dead and mumbling about shadows that could walk. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. Lucky? I wasn't so sure about that. When I tried to tell them what happened, about the moving shadows and my team, they just nodded and wrote things in their notebooks. They said I was confused from hitting my head in the river, but I knew what I saw. I knew what was real. The government people showed up a week later, men in dark suits who asked a lot of questions but didn't seem surprised by my answers. They made me sign some papers, documents that said I wouldn't talk about what happened. Then they sealed off that part of the cave. They said it was because of structural instability. But sometimes, when I drive past Mammoth Cave at night, I see government vehicles parked near that sealed entrance. And if you stand close enough to the cave mouth, though I never do anymore, you can still hear those whispers. That language that's not a language. They never found the bodies of my team, or the original missing spelunkers. Their families were told there was a cave-in, that it was a tragic accident. The official report says 8 people died that day. But I know they didn't die. They're still down there, just not in any way that makes sense in our world. I quit my job after that. I couldn't go back into caves anymore. These days I live in a small house with lots of windows and lights. I never turn them off, not even when I sleep. Because sometimes, in the dark, I see shadows moving the wrong way, and I hear whispers in a language that human tongues were never meant to speak. Some people say, I went crazy down in that cave. Maybe they're right. But I know what I saw, and I know what's still down there, waiting in the dark, getting thinner and thinner, hunting for more people to add to their hollow collection. And that's my story. Believe it or not, it's true. Every word of it. Just, if you ever go cave exploring, remember this. If your shadow starts moving the wrong way, run. Run as fast as you can toward the light, and don't look back. Never look back.